Thank you so much, Paul. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for everyone for coming. It's nice to see some familiar faces and some others. Look forward to discussing this paper. So my plan is to offer kind of an overview of a paper that I'm trying to publish. It's part of one of my research programs, kind of ongoing research programs, which is focused on the philosophy of teacher education and the role of philosophy in teacher education. And one of the major questions within that research program is how to equip teachers and teacher educators to defend themselves against various kind of slogans or fads and fashions in education. So for example, I have a paper published on learning styles, on the myth of learning styles in teaching and teacher education, which is part of that research program as well. So this paper suggests to teachers and teacher educators four complementary angles from which to critically assess novel educational interventions or approaches. So very briefly, and I'll go into each at some length, but the four perspectives are: one, rigorously reviewing empirical research on the intervention in question with some insights from kind of philosophy of statistics and philosophy of methodology. The second perspective is carefully considering the context in which this research is carried out. So again, questions of methodology are prominent there. The third perspective is analyzing the way in which the concepts associated with the intervention may be embedded in or influenced by idiosyncratic features of culture. So a little bit of a hermeneutic lens, philosophical lens in that case. And then the fourth is to pay attention to the integrity of the concepts involved in the educational intervention, in part by returning or turning to ordinary language. So kind of philosophy of language or ordinary language kind of analysis. So those are the four perspectives. Again, I'll kind of detail them throughout the presentation. And I use the case in this paper, I'm using the case of growth mindset interventions to illustrate these four critical perspectives. So I'll be talking a lot about growth mindset, but in general, the purpose is broader, is to kind of introduce these four complementary perspectives, critical perspectives. So hopefully that's clear. I don't have a PowerPoint. I'm a little bit allergic to PowerPoint, so I hope that that's okay. And then we can kind of just talk and so on, and it'll be clear. I tried to structure it as clearly as I could. So just before I get started on the four critical perspectives, I wanted to say a few words about growth mindset theory itself and mindset theory, which many of you may be familiar with, but in case you're not, just a little bit of an introduction to it. So the basics of mindset theory were developed by Carol Dweck in the early 2000s, but many people have since taken up the theory, and it's become nearly ubiquitous in some places, basically. Just as an example, there's a popular classroom app called Class Dojo, which some of you might be familiar with, especially for primary schools. It's very popular. It's explicitly designed with mindset theory in mind, as it were. The company claims that 15 million children worldwide have learned about the importance of having a growth mindset through their apps. So it's clearly a theory which has influenced, a little bit at least, the lives of kind of millions of children. So to have a growth mindset means, for example, that you don't believe your intelligence to be fixed. This is meant to help you interpret challenges you encounter as opportunities for learning. And as such, it's claimed to boost all kinds of desirable achievements, including school grades. That's the basic idea of a growth mindset. Sometimes there's some kind of neuroscience facts that are provided as well to help you understand the mind's plasticity or something like that. But the basic idea is your intelligence or your abilities to learn are not fixed. You can grow them. You can learn from your mistakes and challenges and so on. The opposite of this is to have a quote unquote fixed mindset, which means believing that your own intelligence is fixed. As a result, it is claimed you will not put much effort in trying to become more intelligent. You might think of yourself, for example, as not a math person. And it's claimed that this set of beliefs and attitudes hampers development and learning in various ways. So based on this kind of simple dichotomy of a fixed mindset and a growth mindset, numerous educational interventions have been created, which are intended to help students develop a growth mindset or boost their growth mindset, or however it's phrased, which again, in turn, is meant to have all kinds of positive benefits in terms of grades, behavior or attitudes towards learning, and so on. So again, while I'm following this example of growth mindset interventions throughout the presentation, you'll note that many other educational interventions have a similar structure, right? They identify a particular construct that it is claimed stands in a particularly positive relationship to learning or development, and which is therefore the target of intervention. So one can think of, the research on grit or mindfulness and other things like that. So you have a lot of educational interventions which are sort of aimed at one construct, that then if you enhance that construct, your learning, your grades, your development will somehow be enhanced. And each kind of intervention or construct has a whole kind of theoretical base, an empirical research kind of program around it, or many programs, and crucially, a suite of products for sale to teachers, basically, that are based on this research. So I'll start with the first critical perspective, which is in a sense the most basic critical perspective. I don't even know if it warrants the name critical per se, but just focusing on the empirical research that's available. In a sense, this perspective meets the promoters of these educational interventions on their own playing field, as it were, since interventions are often promoted as being evidence-based, right? So, or what works and so on. So it's kind of like at the same level, kind of meeting these proponents of these interventions. So my article that I'm working on covers a few different dimensions of the empirical evidence base for the effectiveness of growth mindset interventions, but I'll give the short version here, basically. Briefly, the evidence is very mixed. So some studies find a modest effect and others find no effect. As an example of this, there's a very kind of prominent, high-profile publication recently, just last year, in the Psychological Bulletin, which is like a major, high-ranking psychology journal. And it published two major meta-analyses of all prior research on growth mindset interventions. So I'm sure the term meta-analysis is familiar to this group, but these are, research efforts that you take all the research conducted on this kind of intervention. You're trying to look into its effectiveness, and you try to kind of weigh them together and look at their quality and give an overall sense of what the research as a whole is saying, as opposed to just one study. So meta-analyses are often considered kind of the golden standard of overall research synthesis. Now, one of these, and so one would presume, hopefully, that two meta-analyses would give you the same answer. They're looking at all the same research. Now, one of these meta-analyses found a modest effect for these interventions, mostly for low-income students. The other, which controlled especially for studies on which there were authors with a financial incentive in the business of mindset interventions, found no significant effect of mindset interventions. So, and then the same issue in which these two meta-analyses were published includes commentary from several other scholars and some responses from the authors of some of the studies and so on. It's a bit of a heated argument. It gets kind of ugly, actually, some of the commentary on the growth mindset research. And it shows, at minimum, it shows how little agreement there is in the field that growth mindset interventions are even effective, actually. So this alone should give a teacher or teacher educator a pause when considering the implications of mindset theory for their work in the classroom. Just the fact that recent two high-profile meta-analyses are inconclusive, let's say, at best. So beyond reviewing these two meta-analyses in this portion of my paper, I discuss a few more general points about issues associated with empirical research and education more broadly, most of which affect also growth mindset research. So one issue which has come up in the literature is called, or maybe as a feature of educational research, is called effect heterogeneity. So this means that a given intervention will probably not have the same effect on every student or group of students, even if the intervention is identical. Thus, the claim that growth mindset interventions are particularly effective for low-income students. This is kind of an example of that. The argument here is that we shouldn't actually, basically some educational researchers are arguing that we shouldn't be looking for a general effect when studying the effect of a given intervention, such as growth mindset interventions. But rather, we should be looking at their effect on different subgroups within the student population. So this is in fact what some of the more sober proponents of growth mindset interventions have been claiming of late, like in recent years, which is already a step down from the kind of panacea version of the intervention promotion. For example, one of the kind of proponents of growth mindset claimed during a TED talk that equality happens when you kind of implement growth mindset interventions. So while effect heterogeneity seems like a relatively simple amendment, in a sense, it actually qualifies quite substantially the whole idea of what works in educational research as a concept. So this is one kind of concept I offer teachers and teacher educators, just to kind of moderate their understanding of empirical research on such educational interventions. Another kind of basic issue I explore briefly is the replication crisis affecting the entirety of the social sciences, educational research not being an exception. So briefly, as many of you may already be aware, a rather large percentage of published experimental studies in the social sciences have been found to be unreplicable. Teams of researchers have selected rigorous studies in psychology and economics published in the top scientific journals in the world and attempted to replicate them, sometimes with even more rigor than the initial studies, and often somewhere between 40 to 60% or more do not replicate at all. So they don't find a significant result. And even for those who do, sometimes the power of the effect is much smaller than originally calculated. So this again should maybe raise the bar in terms of what would need to be done for an intervention to be truly evidence-based. Maybe it helps us kind of, again, acquire a degree of distance from the results of just a handful of studies or even several studies. Finally, I also point out in this section of my paper that educational research in general has yet to catch up with the best practices put forward by statisticians in recent decades. The vast majority of studies in education, for example, empirical studies in education, do not, for example, pre-register hypotheses, methods, and analyses. Only 2 of the studies surveyed by one of the growth mindset meta-analyses had pre-registered research aims, methods, and planned analyses. So out of like a large pool, I think it was like 61 research projects. Doing so is expensive, it's difficult, and so on, but it just points again to the kind of low quality, in a sense, relatively speaking, of some of the research carried out on these educational interventions. A growing number of researchers in the social sciences are also promoting the use of Bayesian statistical methods, which seem more fitting in educational research, where nearly all of one's variables are connected, and it's unlikely that intervention will have no effect. So just briefly, for those who are a little bit less familiar with statistics, but typically in empirical educational research, one tests a null hypothesis, which is that one's intervention will have no effect, versus that it has some degree of an effect. And then you try to see, like, should I reject the null hypothesis? What's the chances of the null hypothesis being false, and so on. But in education, because of the nature of education, motivation, student relationships with teachers, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, all our variables are so intertwined that it's almost impossible for an educational intervention to really have no effect. Like it seems kind of ludicrous to imagine that it would have no effect whatsoever. So often, the null hypothesis will be rejected anyways. In that case, knowing that, researchers who use Bayesian methods can actually incorporate their previous knowledge and are not testing a null hypothesis at all. They're testing the hypothesis that it will have some effect, they just don't know how much, and so on. So out of all the studies on growth mindset interventions that I looked at as well, there was only 2 that I could find that use Bayesian methods, but only as a secondary method of analysis as well. So again, just another point. Sorry, it's very technical, this part of my paper, but it seems like the quality of research is not as high as it could be to really give us a lot of confidence that these interventions are effective. This doesn't mean, of course, that we should ignore all educational research that doesn't follow these like kind of rigorous best practices I put forward, but we are warranted in increasing our level of caution when they are, when these best practices are not being followed. Moving on to the second critical perspective that I recommend to teachers and teacher educators, I use the term kind of considering context as my shorthand name for this second critical perspective. So Carol Dweck herself, the kind of originator of the mindset theory, in response to all the mixed evidence around the effectiveness of growth mindset interventions, she's emphasized the relevance of context and various contextual factors in the implementation of growth mindset interventions. So she's pointed out, for example, that those designing and delivering growth mindset interventions might not always have the level of insight and understanding of the theory necessary to do so. So sort of her claim here is that, okay, this guy who found no effect of the intervention, maybe the people implementing the intervention didn't have the degree of insight and understanding necessary to do a proper intervention. This is kind of a reasonable claim. But reasonable as it is, it has many implications for the intervention's cost and scalability. So often the claim of these interventions is that they're kind of simple to carry out. It's a simple workshop, anyone can do it. But now the founder of mindset theory is claiming that actually not everyone can carry it out. You need a certain degree of insight to design one and to carry it out for it to be effective. So Dweck's point here is actually related to a package of concerns that are sometimes brought under the umbrella of the concept of implementation fidelity. So if we're to measure the effectiveness of an intervention, we need to be sure that the intervention has been implemented with relative fidelity to the theory or whatever it is in a relatively uniform way. And this is, to say the least, extremely difficult to achieve. Like implementation fidelity in education is extremely challenging. You can imagine if you're testing like, X number of classrooms or whatever with an intervention, you have to somehow make sure that everyone delivering the intervention is doing so as identically as possible in order to have implementation fidelity. But as any teacher knows, every classroom is quite, there's a lot of things going on in a classroom. Almost for sure it won't be delivered exactly in the same way, and so on. Um, Other promoters of growth mindset interventions have in recent years emphasized the vital importance of other contextual factors, without which the interventions may have little or no effect, they claim. So namely, two that have been mentioned are the mindsets of the teachers involved themselves in the intervention, and the presence of peer norms that align with growth mindset messaging. So these are fairly big caveats, and these are kind of have been pronounced by some of the kind of major proponents of mindset theory. So just to repeat them, they're saying that these mindset interventions might not be affected if the teachers themselves don't have this sort of uh, mindset as well, a growth mindset, and also that peer norms in a school or a classroom should also align with the growth mindset messaging. So these kind of two caveats should already help moderate enthusiasm for these kinds of interventions. Um, in fact, if you keep thinking about it, there are actually so many contextual factors that could affect any educational intervention that some researchers have suggested that we should actually give up on trying to find out, quote unquote, what works, and should rather be content with figuring out under what conditions something works. So this is something that some researchers are saying about educational interventions. Another feature of growth mindset interventions in particular that makes them difficult to study is that true control groups are becoming increasingly difficult to find since so many students have been exposed to growth mindset interventions, whether through a workshop at school or through the Class Dojo app, or maybe even their teachers and so on. So again, uh, when you're doing an empirical research, you always need usually a control group that has not been kind of exposed to growth mindset messaging or something like that. But it's become so ubiquitous, like so many students have heard about it, or so many teachers have heard about it in some context, that finding a true control group is actually a little bit challenging. And anecdotally, I've spoken to actually many high school students in Montreal, where I reside, who've actually developed a degree of cynicism about the idea of a growth mindset because it's been hammered into them so many times. So it's very interesting to hear, a 15-year-old be like, oh yeah, growth mindset, and kind of sarcastically talk about it. Um, and for me, it reminded me basically of this, what's called the double hermeneutic effect in the social science research, right? That where the interventions of social scientists can subsequently shape the phenomena which they have described. So this is kind of well known among kind of in hermeneutic philosophy that when you intervene with human beings, it's a whole different case, of course, than intervening with inanimate objects or even in most animals and so on. The rock doesn't care whether you've classified it wrong or something like that. But if you call the child something like, say, oh, you have a fixed mindset or you have a growth mindset, it actually changes the child's self-perception as well in some unpredictable way. You don't know exactly how they're going to interpret it and so on. So I mean, in a sense, that's the whole purpose of a growth mindset intervention, is to like give the child a new self-conception and so on. But it's hard to know where that will go. And again, I've seen it anecdotally, kind of have a sort of a cynical sort of reinforcing a kind of a cynicism about this kind of thing. The final point here about context, I wanted to point out that qualitative research is often better placed to be sensitive to context. Although one should remember that it does not typically aim at generalization of arriving at kind of a what works sort of statement. We can't therefore point to qualitative research in order to determine if growth mindset interventions are effective, period. Even if that remains a reasonable question, because some don't think it's necessarily very reasonable. There's also mixed methodologies and so on. Obviously, it's much more complex than what I've kind of mentioned, but again, my point is to sort of highlight certain concepts and trains of thought for teachers and teacher educators when evaluating the effectiveness of these educational interventions. Moving on to my third critical perspective, which is about the influence of culture. In a sense, this third critical perspective is also about context, but it's like the broadest possible context, really, of culture, broadly speaking. So I want to introduce, maybe some of you are familiar, it's become quite popular, but there's a kind of an interesting research program among cross-cultural psychologists and a few other social scientists that have identified what they call, they're kind of interested in what they call weird psychology, or and its associations. So weird is an acronym they use, and it's for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. This is Joe Henrich and some of his colleagues. And they've pointed out that, a lot of social science research is carried out with these populations that are Western, educated, rich, industrialized, democratic, and that these are outliers psychologically. When you do cross-cultural psychology, often people with that kind of background often are outliers when it comes to personality research, all kinds of psychology and economics and other kind of fields. Now, the irony here is that a lot of axioms and theories and kind of major paradigms or whatever in psychology are grown not only, they're basically grown by surveying this population, this weird population. Not only that, they're often grown by surveying, students within the faculties of these same professors who carry out this research. So often a psychology professor will design a survey to validate their theory and so on. And often the ones who are approached to carry out the surveys are psychology students themselves. And these Joe Henrich and his colleagues have pointed out that these people are even weirder than the general weird population. The undergrad psych student is not the kind of typical profile of a Westerner in general, and then human being in general. So the analogy I like to think of is that studying weird populations is kind of like, in order to get insight into a human being, is kind of like studying penguins to understand birds. So penguins are birds, but they're kind of strange birds. They don't fly, they swim, etc. So it's not that, Westerners are not human beings, obviously not, but they tend to be, again, major outliers on even some of the most basic psychology theories. So, drawing attention even to something as well established as the big five personality traits, which is like a major kind of theory in personality psychology. Many cross-cultural psychologists have pointed out that this thing doesn't really pan out in certain cross-cultural contexts and so on. So it's a big question a little bit about kind of the origins of our thinking in terms of psychology and so on. Some have even suggested that theoretical commitments can be influenced by weird psychology, depending on where theories originate from. So for example, just to give a little bit of an example for growth mindset, there's some evidence that some, for example, students from China broke with mindset theory's basic premises by believing in both fixed intelligence and the importance of effort together, which according to mindset theory are meant to be mutually exclusive beliefs, right? If you think that your intelligence is fixed, it means that you won't put effort into something. But some pools of students in different cultures will actually believe in both of these things at the same time. So returning to this critical angle of kind of culture, I want to kind of examine mindset theory against the background of certain features of Western culture to see how, weird it might be, again, in quotation marks, the acronym, as opposed to some, timeless and contextless discovery of the learning sciences. This line of inquiry might also reveal ways in which mindset theory might be misinterpreted in weird contexts. So I take two cultural tendencies as examples here. One is the belief in self-reliance, and the other one is kind of romantic individualism. So mindset theory does not necessarily imply that we should rely on ourselves, but where the conviction in self-reliance is strong, such as in North America, mindset theory can easily and naturally be recruited into the kind of pull yourself up by your own bootstraps sort of ideology. Complete self-reliance, of course, is an illusion, right? We all rely on others in myriad ways, and none of our accomplishments are ever purely the result of our own efforts. Though the amount of effort we put into our projects matters, of course. So mindset theory can actually exacerbate this illusion and drive students into a bind. So on the one hand, the student who fails often enough, despite attempting to rely on themselves and maintain a growth mindset, may end up concluding that the self upon which they are relying is just not good enough. The student's mindset might therefore degenerate into a fixed one, even though they're like, in a sense, trying to have a kind of a growth mindset. On the other hand, a student who succeeds, consciously embracing a growth mindset, believing in self-reliance and so on, may experience a kind of a confirmation bias. Mistakenly believing that one is succeeding purely as a result of one's own efforts may also lead to kind of arrogance and impatience with others who have failed for some reason to adopt or keep a growth mindset. Some researchers have found, researchers not necessarily looking at growth mindset itself, but they've noticed kind of the influence of this belief in self-reliance in North American context and how it develops some of these attitudes. Eventually, even the second student who's experiencing success will, of course, encounter failure. We all do at some point. and they can come crashing down even harder than the first student who failed at the outset. They may also end up blaming others for their failure, alternatively. So the combination of mindset theory and self-reliance can sort of bias our interpretations of success and failure. The second weird cultural tendency I want to highlight here is romantic individualism, which is kind of given expression by mindset theory and some kind of expressions of it, and which further distorts its application. So by romantic individualism, I mean sort of like a loose set of modern dispositions that include our tendency to turn inward, to focus on our feelings, and to emphasize the importance of believing in ourselves. Now, it's easy to see how mindset theory fits neatly into this set of dispositions, subtly altering as it does so. Mindset theory is very attractive to those who are convinced that if you believe in yourself, you'll be able to do whatever you desire. Concern about the actual truth of one's beliefs about oneself fades into the background. So while Dweck is wary of the believe in yourself slogan in her original kind of formulation of mindset theory, the language she's used in her publications to describe mindset theory certainly springs from and further reinforces romantic individualism. So here's a quote from her kind of famous best-selling book on the topic. She says, changing people's beliefs, even the simplest beliefs, can have profound effects. In this book, you'll learn how a simple belief about yourself, a belief we discovered in our research, guides a large part of your life. In fact, it permeates every part of your life. This is kind of from her introduction. So it's true, of course, that our beliefs are powerful, but they're not all powerful, especially if they have no grounding in reality, which it doesn't quite touch on this aspect. So unfailingly believing in oneself is also not a very sound epistemic practice. Iris Murdoch famously called our attention to our, quote, fat, relentless ego, end quote, which is constantly churning out fantasies that blind us to reality. So that's the kind of self we don't want to believe in. That's like generating fantasies and blocking and veiling us from reality. So what self exactly are we supposed to believe in is a question kind of that's not really asked by this kind of romantic individualism. So there's other cultural tendencies one could point to and so on. But in any case, maybe this helps begin to explain why mindset theory has become so popular in the West. At the very least, we should be wary about promoting mindset theory internationally where their other cultural norms are present. And it's also worth asking whether self-reliance and romantic individualism are even worth reinforcing in the West itself, which is obviously incredibly diverse in general. So this analysis maybe also drives home the point that growth mindset interventions are likely to have many unintended effects on students mediated through cultural ideals. So again, this is kind of, that concludes sort of that critical perspective of looking at culture and so on. Hopefully that was clear. It's a little bit, have to work on the examples maybe a little bit more, but there's more detail in the paper basically, but it gives you a sense of what I mean by situating growth mindset and interventions in a broader cultural context and seeing how it comes from and maybe reinforces certain aspects of culture. Now, the final critical perspective I want to draw our attention to is kind of conceptual integrity in ordinary language. So it involves an analysis of conceptual integrity, often with careful attention to ordinary language. The latter is important because of how so many educational fads find their origin in psychological constructs that are kind of related to ordinary language, but often reduce it in various ways. So I'll kind of illustrate what I mean as we go. In the case of mindset theory, questions have been raised about the concept of intelligence, which is central to it. So I mentioned way at the beginning that the key idea here for growth mindset is, you believe your intelligence is fixed or not, and so on. So the concept of intelligence is quite crucial and central to mindset theory. Now, of course, the term intelligence is ambiguous and infamously controversial when it comes to IQ tests, for example, which is often kind of sidestepped by the whole mindset theory discussion. But that ambiguity here can present problems since in order to measure mindset, students have to answer questions that involve the word intelligence. In fact, there's one study I found that showed that different understandings of intelligence among students predicted different growth mindset scores, which is quite worrying in general, when one's basic understanding of the concepts involved in the surveys is at play here. In play. So that's one of the concepts that there's significant questions about it in mindset theory. And then there's the two concepts of growth mindset and fixed mindset themselves, these two concepts, which are of course meant to be mutually exclusive and opposite to one another. These also present issues. Some researchers have found that students can hold both mindsets at the same time, which suggests that they should be treated separately, as opposed to kind of reverse coding fixed or growth mindset items in questionnaires. So often when people are testing growth mindset, they assume that if a student kind of answers a survey item in a way that would indicate a fixed mindset, it's like reverse coded that, oh, it's like the opposite of the growth mindset. But if they can hold the two at the same time, you can't necessarily do that. So that brings forward a lot of questions about their kind of being mutually exclusive and so on. Um, Other issues regarding conceptual integrity have presented themselves. So some researchers have suggested that growth mindset is not a unitary concept at all and is instead comprised of or associated with a number of sub-abilities or skills, most of them interrelated, such as like self-control, self-regulation, self-efficacy, self-awareness, self-esteem. You'll note the prevalence of self there, which is, I think, also part of romantic individualism. But this raises further questions about the mechanisms involved in fostering a growth mindset in students. There's actually no agreement about these mechanisms in the literature, which raises further conceptual issues. So one survey article I looked at laid out sort of, even in the last 5 years, in 5 or 10 years in major journals, I think they identified like 6 or 9 like major different theoretical models for how growth mindsets are actually conceived of in the literature. So even when people go about testing these, they're testing like different theoretical constructs often. There isn't just kind of one theoretical kind of mechanism that's being measured or tested rather. So there's a bunch of debate about the link, what the actual mechanisms are. So there are many constructs devised and employed by psychologists that are meant to stand in a positive relationship to our ability to learn. So in other words, that by increasing or possessing a given construct, one will enhance learning. Self-efficacy is one such construct. It's a very famous one, has a kind of a longer pedigree than compared to kind of growth mindset. But the link, if any, between such constructs like self-efficacy and growth mindset is the subject of some debate as well. But one worries, though, about the ongoing multiplication of terms and research programs that may be speaking just past one another, as it were. So again, there's so many, right? Self-efficacy, grit, mindfulness, there's many, many, many constructs that psychologists have kind of devised. Sometimes they devise them or pick them up, and they're trying to kind of figure out their relationship to learning. And currently, educators and educational institutions seem to be pressed upon by an ever-growing panoply of competing intervention products, in some cases aggressively marketed by edtech companies. And each of these products is dedicated to one or another construct or set of constructs meant to enhance learning. But they each live somewhat separately in their own sphere of research and practice. You do sometimes find like a kind of a, how do you say, a crossover, like someone will measure grit and, growth mindset at the same time or something like that. But largely you see like whole different literatures basically on these different concepts and terms. This isn't really an ideal scenario, especially given the scarcity of educational resources. So I just want to kind of flag that in general. Now, an even more fundamental concern, perhaps, is that ordinary language itself offers us a plethora of concepts that are no doubt relevant to learning. So generally speaking, students are more likely to learn, it is safe to assume, if they are open-minded, attentive, humble, perseverant, curious, reflective, keen, patient, perceptive, organized, diligent, hardworking, inquisitive, imaginative, and so on. They are less likely to learn if they are being stubborn or impatient, disorganized, distracted, arrogant, lazy, prideful, complacent, apathetic, and so on. In addition to these traits, there are also innumerable capacities that seem relevant, just, again, from ordinary language, the capacity to listen, to pay attention, to concentrate, to see a task through to its end, to discern relevant details, to memorize content, to recognize patterns, to take joy in the progress of others, to formulate questions, etc. One can also think about various emotional or character dispositions, such as caring about the truth and accuracy, being passionate about learning. So these lists I've just enumerated, they barely scratch the surface, of course. There's so much more you can find in ordinary language to describe, things that might help or hinder learning. Now, one wonders like, well, how are all of these related to possessing a so-called growth mindset or something like that? Reducing student achievement or success in general to the overwhelming efficacy of a single construct, such as one's mindset, inadvertently flattens the rich vocabulary we have at our disposal to talk about learning. So the solution to this issue isn't really easy to envision. Like, what do we do? Are we to have separate research programs for each and every trait that is suspected to contribute to learning or achievement? Aren't they quite interrelated to a high degree? And how do the constructs created by learning scientists, such as growth mindset, relate to this ordinary language and the mix of superstition and accumulated wisdom contained therein? Right? It's not that ordinary language has all the solutions, of course, for kind of figuring out how we learn, but definitely there's some wisdom in there mixed with, probably superstition and other things. These questions are not really easily answered, but I think even posing them helps provide another critical angle from which to view the research on educational interventions. So I'm moving towards my conclusion. That concludes kind of the fourth critical perspective. So of course, all of what I said doesn't invalidate the basic insight of mindset theory that was first proposed, right? That one's belief about one's abilities, whether they are fixed or can grow, can influence learning and achievement. It's very possible, I think, to acknowledge that insight while maintaining a critical view of all the research accumulated to date and of the time and money that should be invested in mindset interventions. In the meantime, we can certainly tell teachers that they should not think of their students' abilities as fixed. I think few teachers would admit to believing that anyways. Maybe some would, and if we notice that students are laboring under that misconception, we can try to educate them out of it. I don't think it's very kind of mysterious in that sense. But we shouldn't expect, however, that these simple steps will revolutionize education, I don't think. Like the springs of motivation, it seems to me, lie deeper than this relatively simple belief. And if we need to be, and we also need to be careful that we don't inadvertently kind of reinforce troubling cultural tendencies or flatten the rich vocabulary at our disposal for researching and talking about learning. So my hope is that this illustration of the four critical perspectives is helpful in showing an example of one strand of any effective teacher education program, equipping teachers to resist the lure of educational panaceas. I hope it also shows one way in which philosophy can enrich teacher education programs, as I have drawn naturally on many areas of philosophy in the presentation, including like philosophy of science, philosophy of social science and social scientific methodology, philosophy of modernity, hermeneutics, philosophy of language, etc. My underlying ambition here is to show that quality teacher education programs need a good dose of philosophy. But I imagine that in the context of this PESGB seminar, I'm preaching to the choir in that context. But anyways, thank you so much. That's all I have.
Well, thank you very much.